Hi, I want to talk today about one of the key moves in the theory of knowledge. A basic question is not simply what is knowledge and is knowledge even possible, the basic questions we've been considering so far, but about the sources of knowledge. Suppose knowledge is possible. Where does it come from? How do we derive it? There are different answers, of course. Much knowledge I gain from, well, the outside world, experience of the outside world. I perceive things. So I recognize, for example, that there are keys on the table. And in doing that, I do, well, in this case, I have a visual perception, but I also touch them, I can hear them. Through a variety of senses, quite frequently, a complex of senses, we get information about the outside world. The empiricist says that's the only way we get information about the world. We perceive things. We gain experience of the world through the senses. The rationalist says there's something more than that. Yes, much of our knowledge comes from the outside world, but there are additional things, additional sources. So not all of our beliefs are coming from experience, says the rationalist, and some of those beliefs are quite reasonable. Some even count as knowledge, but we can derive them from another source. What kind of other source could there be besides perception of the world? Answer is looking inside our own heads. Through meditation, through reflection, through contemplating the structure of our own minds. So let's take a look at rationalism as it's classically developed in the Enlightenment period, and we're going to look especially today at the views of Leibniz. Leibniz, co-inventor of the calculus and diplomat by profession, was also a great philosopher. His philosophy is sometimes hard to untangle because he didn't write one or a few great philosophical works. Instead, he wrote a variety of shorter works. And so one has to gather those up and compile them and try to understand the overall view. But it's very clear that Leibniz is a rationalist. In fact, one of his extended works is the Nouveaux essais. That is to say, the new essays concerning human understanding, which were a critique of Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Locke is one of the great defenders of empiricism. Leibniz critiques that view and argues in favor of rationalism instead. Well, what is the difference between these two views? Empiricism is simply the view that all of our knowledge of the world comes from experience. It all has its basis in perception. That's not to say we're limited to immediate perception of things like there are keys and the keys make this noise and so on. But we can reflect on that, we can infer things from that, we can gain from other people's experience by listening to their testimony, their reports. We can read books about the experiences of others. And in that way, our knowledge of the world is coming from, in part, our own experience, but in part, the collective experience of humanity. The rationalist says, well, that's all fine. That's a major source of knowledge. It's not the only source of knowledge. Some knowledge is actually inborn. It is innate in their phraseology. It's something that is, if you will, hardwired into us. There are certain things about the world that we are simply built to understand from the very beginning. The contrast between rationalism and empiricism is not merely a philosophical debate, though it is largely that. Psychologists also sometimes adopt rationalist, sometimes empiricist approaches, and study the question of whether babies, for example, have innate knowledge of things like causation or other concepts that they are born with, or whether these are things that they gain through experience. And so it's still an active area of psychological research, and there is no consensus about this issue. It's still very much a live debate. We can distinguish two kinds of rationalism and two kinds of empiricism. There's a fundamental difference between concepts or ideas, as Descartes, Locke, Leibniz, and others of this period refer to it as, or knowledge of judgments. So I have concepts, for example, of triangles, of redness, of friendship, but I also make judgments about those things. I might judge that that dot is red, for example, or that those two people are friends. And there's a basic difference between having the concept or the idea and then using that as part of a judgment, saying something about the world. Well, rationalists and empiricists can disagree about both, and typically do disagree about both, not just one or the other. So there are concept forms and judgment forms of both rationalism and empiricism. What does the concept form look like with respect to empiricism? It's the view that all of our concepts come from experience. All my ideas come through perception, my own perception or other people's perception. All of these ideas are coming from the collective perceptions, the collective experience of humanity. Judgment empiricism is the view that all of our knowledge of the world comes from experience. So it's not just a question of getting all of our ideas from experience, we are also gaining all of our knowledge of the world from experience. No concepts and no judgments are sort of built into us, hardwired into us, and given at birth. They are all things we acquire through experience of the world. The rationalist believes just the opposite of those things. Concept rationalism is the view that some concepts don't come from experience. They're innate. They really are hardwired into us. Judgment rationalism is the view that some of our knowledge of the world is not coming from experience. It's a priori, to use the philosophical term of art. It is independent of experience. A priori is simply Latin for prior to. It is, or from something prior, really. A priori is a term used by medieval philosophers like Aquinas to indicate things that could be done even prior to experience, independently of experience, without having experienced anything yet. A posteriori is the opposite of that. It means from something afterward, from something that in this case is experience. So the rationalist view is this. Concept version, there are innate ideas or concepts. We come built in with certain kinds of ideas already in the mind. And the judgment version, there is a priori knowledge of the world. We know some things about the world that are independent of experience. We know them simply because of the structure of our own minds. We're born with that knowledge. Well, the concept rationalist then holds that there are innate concepts, innate ideas. Leibniz puts it this way: can it be denied that there is much that is innate in our mind, since we are, so to speak, innate to ourselves? And since in ourselves there are, and now here we get a list of things that he takes to be candidates of innate ideas: being, unity, substance, duration, change, activity, perception, pleasure, and 1,000 other objects of our intellectual ideas. Now look carefully at that list. He's saying, I don't learn what being is from experience. I come already equipped, recognizing things that I experience as being, as existing. The same thing is true of unity. I don't have to learn what an object is. My mind comes with that concept already built in. I organize my experience by treating it as experience of objects. So I have an experience, even as a baby maybe, of keys like this. And I recognize that as some kind of object. And then perhaps I look more carefully and realize, well, this is several different objects connected together by this ring. And so in doing that, I am organizing my various sensations of touch, of sight, of sound, and I'm actually thinking then about the various connections between these and thinking, well, this is a thing or a set of things. And so notice what's happening there. I am organizing my experience. I don't learn that this is an object. I don't get the idea of objects from experience, says Leibniz. My mind comes with that concept built in. I automatically organize my experience into experience of objects. The same thing is true of something like pleasure. The baby already understands pleasure and pain. The baby is born. To get it started breathing, it gets a little slap. Well, it right away recognizes pain. It doesn't have to learn through experience what pain is. It knows right away, this is bad. And by the way, there's a judgment there. Not only, I have the concept of this and I don't like it, it's bad. And so you might say there's a judgment built in there that's innate. The baby doesn't have to learn pain hurts. The baby already is built in such a way that it recognizes that pain is not a good thing and it's to be avoided. Now the same thing is true, Leibniz is saying, with duration, with change, with activity, perception, all sorts of things. I close my eyes and I realize I'm not seeing anything. I open them, I am seeing something. And so the idea of perceiving something, of seeing something, well, the empiricist will say, I'm deriving that from the experience of opening and closing my eyes. Leibniz says, I recognize what I'm doing when I open my eyes as fundamentally different from what happens when I close them. Not because I'm learning that through experience, but just because that idea is already built into me. I already have the idea of myself as a sensing, perceiving being. So Leibniz continues, as these objects are immediate objects of our understanding and are always present, though they can't always be consciously perceived because of our distractions and wants, why should it be surprising that we say that these ideas, along with all that depends on them, are innate in us? There's an important distinction philosophically in the background here. We can talk about ideas being in the mind in two different senses. Sometimes they're in the mind occurrently, when I'm thinking about them. Other times they're in the mind dispositionally. So if we think about this for a moment, we can recognize that there are a lot of ideas that I have, and some of them are operating right now. So let me draw a little picture of my mind. Here it is, and I've got thoughts going on in it in rapid succession, so I won't try to draw that in. I can't really animate it. But let's say we're talking about rationalism. We're talking about perception, experience. We're talking about things being innate. And those things are occurrent in my mind. I'm actively thinking about them right now. There are all sorts of concepts I have in my mind that are in what Indian philosophers refer to as the storehouse of my mind that are actually not being mobilized right now. For example, now it's hard to give you an example because the moment I mention it, it's going to be a current. I'm going to be thinking about it. But so right now, I think suddenly, aha, I have the concept of an airplane. I can recognize an airplane, but until that moment, it was not a current in my mind. So when I started speaking, airplane was somewhere here in the background. So it's really part of my mind, but we'll treat it as a warehouse or a storehouse where these concepts are kept for use. They're there in the mind in the sense that I do have these concepts. I can mobilize them. I can use them when I want. But on the other hand, I'm not doing it at a given moment. So all sorts of things are here. The concept of an airplane, the concept of a train, the concept of a house, the concept of various colors, and all this sort of thing is there. I can recognize things as having colors. I can recognize things as houses or as airplanes or as trains, but I may not be doing it at the moment. And as I'm thinking about those things, of course, I've sort of forgotten about innateness and rationalism and perception. Well, I haven't forgotten them. They become dispositionally there. They're available. They're ready to be used, but they're not being used. So you might say, these are the things that are more or less ready to be used, and these are the things that are actually being used. So again, the philosophical term of art for this, these are occurrent in the mind. They're actually occurring. These things are dispositions, or they're in the mind dispositionally. They're ready to be used, but I'm not actually using them right now. At one point, I referred to concepts or ideas in this Enlightenment tradition, what Descartes refers to as the new way of ideas, as first-order cognitive abilities. And I tend to think of them that way. I'm not sure Locke and Descartes and Leibniz did. I'm certain that Berkeley didn't. But in any case, whatever they are, they're something like these dispositions. They're these capacities. And they can be used and become active in the mind, but we can also have them in the mind, in the background, in the storehouse. And that's what Leibniz is talking about. He's talking about having all of these things there in the storehouse ready to be used. So I can recognize something as a pleasure or as a pain. I can recognize something as an object. I can recognize it as continuing, enduring through time. I can recognize when I'm perceiving things and when I'm not. And so in all of those cases, he's saying those concepts are already in the mind. Even the baby already has them ready to go. Now, it may be that some experiences are required to trigger them. And so it might be that let's say, this is a cruel experiment, but let's say at birth we stop up a baby's ears so it can't hear anything. And then later, we take the things out so the baby can hear. That would be a way, highly unethical, you're not going to get that approved by the IRB, but what will happen is, well, either the baby will have lost the ability to hear altogether, which is possible, or it will be that those abilities suddenly get triggered, but it may well be that they were there all along. Now, if we return to what Leibniz is saying, the thought that these various things are there dispositionally, should give us more reason to think, yes, there are things innate in us that we don't have to learn. These abilities we have to recognize things even from a very, very young age. So, the same issue arises when we turn to the other form of rationalism, when we turn to judgment rationalism. Here's how Leibniz frames the issue. There is the question whether the soul in itself is entirely empty, like a writing tablet on which nothing has yet been written, a tabula rasa. That's the opinion of Aristotle, he says, and the author of the essay, Locke. And whether everything that's inscribed upon it comes solely from the senses and experience. Before I go on here, let me just point out, this is a very famous passage. Often people will describe the empiricist as somebody who believes in a tabula rasa, that the mind is a blank slate. Actually, Locke never uses that term. The term comes from Leibniz's criticism of Locke, where he says, this is the view underlying the view of Aristotle, the view of Locke, that in the end, well, the mind comes to us initially as just a blank slate. Locke's term is actually, it comes to us as a white sheet of paper on which nothing has been written. And then everything written on it comes from experience. It comes from perception. Anyway, that's one view. That's the view of Aristotle, of Locke, of the empiricist. But Leibniz says, or, and now he's going to give you the rationalist view, whether the soul originally contains the principles of several notions and doctrines, which are merely roused on certain occasions by external objects, as I hold, along with Plato, and even with the schoolmen. By the schoolmen, he means the scholastic philosophers of the medieval period, so people like Aquinas, for example. So that's the contrast he's drawing, both with respect to the notions, that is to say the ideas and concepts, but also, crucially here, with respect to the principles, the doctrines. Are they all things that we learn on the basis of experience, or does the soul, the mind, originally contain some of these? Does it already come equipped with certain kinds of knowledge? Now notice he does say, they're roused on certain occasions by some objects. It may be that there's a bit of knowledge that I'm born with, but I don't even recognize it. It's there dispositionally, but it doesn't become a current until it's triggered in some way. Or maybe some of these require repeated triggering. It's there, and I do have that capacity, but it takes a while for it to happen. It's not like the first time I see something, immediately I recognize it. Maybe it takes me a while to recognize it. And that's why, by the way, psychologists still debate this issue. The baby, for example, will start recognizing objects as distinct objects somewhere between 6 and 9 months old. It's the same with causation. They will start being surprised, for example, if a rubber ducky turns into a train when it goes behind a screen and comes out the other side. Until then, they're really not that surprised. Rubber ducky comes in, emerges as a rubber ducky. Oh, rubber ducky comes in, emerges as a train. Oh, pretty much the same thing to the baby until it's 6 to 9 months old. And then suddenly it sees the rubber ducky go in and come out. Yeah, rubber duck. And then it sees it turn into a train. It's like, oh. And what's going on there? The empiricists will say the baby has learned something about what objects are and that they generally persist over time and that something surprising has happened. The rationalists will say the baby always had that ability. It was born with that ability, but it had to experience enough of these surprises for that to be triggered, for that thing to stop being merely dispositional and to become a current. And so is that something that's been tucked in the recesses of the mind and then has to be triggered through some repetition? Or is that something that the baby is learning from experience and learning, hey, things tend to go constantly. Hands don't suddenly turn into rubber ducks. Rubber ducks don't suddenly turn into trains. And eventually they figure out, hey, it's pretty surprising if something like that appears to happen. Well, in any case, that idea that certain things are lurking there but have to be triggered, maybe triggered by repeated experiences, that's something that makes this a hard issue to evaluate and decide. So here are the two models. Locke's a blank sheet of paper. White paper, nothing's been written on it yet. We don't yet have any of the ideas. The light bulb there is meant to symbolize an idea. That's not yet in or on the paper. It's something that has to be added through experience. And so we have to gain our ideas from experience. We have to write down bits of knowledge on that tablet from experience. Notice sometimes experience makes us erase something on the tablet. We form some conclusion and then we take it back on the basis of further perception and experience. All swans are white, people thought for decades, even centuries, until in the middle of Australia, people found black swans. And suddenly they had to erase all swans are white and put down something else. So it can be gaining that new idea, it can be writing down a bit of knowledge, it can be erasing something that it turns out wasn't true. Leibniz's picture is different. He says the mind is like marble, and it already comes with a structure. Certain things are already there. And so what does a sculptor do? They have to look at the faults in the marble. And if they're going to sculpt something, they have to realize, I have to pay attention to that. I can't turn this into a certain kind of shape if those striations are going to mean it's going to be weak. And as soon as I try to cut the marble there, this whole part is going to fall off. So there's already a structure in the marble that there isn't in the white sheet of paper. Now notice, there's no sculpture yet in that piece of marble, and so it's rather like nothing is yet occurrent. But dispositionally, there's a lot there. That bit of marble has a lot of dispositions about what kinds of shapes it can form, what kinds of shapes it's going to be very difficult to make it go into. Whereas the white sheet of paper is not like that. It really doesn't place many constraints on what's written on it. So the empiricist is going to say the mind is like that white sheet of paper, nothing yet written on it when we're born, and then experience writes on it. Leibniz, no, the mind is like this, and experience sculpts it, but much of the way it's going to end up looking is already determined by the structure it has, even at birth. Well, the judgment rationalist, then, to summarize, says there is a priori knowledge of the world, knowledge independent of experience. It is truly a priori. We don't need to derive it from experience, though experience might be required to trigger it. It's also a priori in the sense that it is something that is, you might say, hardwired in. It's built into us. It is something we can obtain by an understanding of the structure of our own minds, not experience of the outside world. But also, it is really knowledge of the world. It is not simply an a priori knowledge that you might say is purely logical, purely verbal. It's not like a bachelor is an unmarried man, where you might know that just on the basis of knowing the meanings of the words. It's something else. We've drawn separately in separate videos some distinctions, and we can use those distinctions to formulate this in a bit of philosophical vocabulary. One distinction is semantic. Analytic statements have their truth value determined by the meanings of their terms. So bachelors are unmarried is a good example. It's true, and you don't have to know anything about the real world. It would be foolish to apply for a grant to study the question of whether bachelors are unmarried. Of course they are. That's the meaning of the term. And so there's nothing to investigate. It doesn't tell you anything about the world. It simply tells you something about the meaning of the term bachelor. A synthetic statement is really about the world. The truth value depends on the world, not merely on the meanings of terms. So a synthetic statement is something that you would expect to actually have to investigate the world to find out. If somebody makes the claim bachelors are unhappy, well, that's a claim about the world. It's not built into the concept or the meaning of the term bachelor. But bachelors are unmarried, that really is simply built into the meaning of the term. So that distinction is one we can use because when we talk about something being a priori knowledge of the world, we mean it's synthetic. It's not merely analytic knowledge like bachelors or bachelors are unmarried. It's something really about the world. The second distinction is the epistemic distinction I've already mentioned between the a priori and the a posteriori. The a priori is knowable independently of experience. A posteriori, knowable only through experience. There's a bit of squishiness there, knowable by whom, and knowable in fact or in principle, but again, I've talked about that separately. The issue is simply, from Leibniz's point of view, and really from the point of view of this entire Enlightenment debate, knowable for us, knowable in fact for us. And that's something that, well, is usually not at stake when we think about the various issues that psychologists debate, for example, or that philosophers worry about. It's something knowable for us, and it's not something that we have to worry about infinite procedures or other complicated things to think about whether it would be knowable under those circumstances. Well, here's how we then might frame the thesis of judgment rationalism. It's the view that there are synthetic a priori truths. There are truths that are synthetic. They are really about the world, not merely about the meanings of terms, but also they are a priori. They're things we can know independently of experience. So we could simply put it this way without the jargon: we can learn something about the world independently of experience, from reason alone, just from reflection on the structure of our own minds, our own innate concepts, and the innate principles that are given to us at birth. So Leibniz says there is another question, whether all truths are dependent on experience, that is, on induction and instances, or whether there's some that have yet another foundation. He's asking whether all truths are a posteriori, based on induction, instances, perception of the world, or whether there are some that have another foundation, that are truly a priori. So if that's the issue that divides the rationalist from the empiricist, we can frame it this way. One distinction is the semantic distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. The other, the epistemic distinction between the a priori and a posteriori. Nobody thinks in this entire period that anything could be analytic and a posteriori. If it follows simply from the meanings of the terms, all I have to know is language. I don't have to have any experience of the world. So everyone agrees that analytic statements are all a priori. I can know those just by knowing my language. Now, of course, it requires some experience to learn my language, but assume that the language is simply given. Then, if I know the language, I don't need any further experience of the world. I already have certain things that I know a priori, namely analytic things. They're about language, they're not about the world. I also have synthetic a posteriori knowledge, and everybody agrees about that. That's something that when I know, hey, some dogs are black, or I am jingling keys. Those things are things that are really statements about the world. They don't follow from the meanings of the terms. So they're synthetic, they're a posteriori. I have to learn them from experience. The real question is whether anything is synthetic and a priori. It's really about the world, that's the synthetic part, but it's also something we could know independently of experience. That's the a priori part. Well, the empiricist says, no, there's nothing like that. Okay, there are no synthetic a priori judgments. Everything that is a truth about the world is derived from experience. So all synthetic statements are a posteriori. All analytic statements are a priori. And if you look at that box, you can recognize, aha, the empiricist is saying there are really only two kinds of truths. There are those that are analytic and a priori, that we can know independently of experience just by knowing language, so they're purely verbal, or there are things that are really about the world and all of them are derived from experience. Every bit of knowledge has to fit into one of those two boxes. Every truth has to fit into one of those two boxes. The judgment rationalist, on the other hand, says no, there are synthetic a priori truths. Some of my knowledge of the world, much of it even, is coming from experience. But some knowledge of the world comes from another source. It is something built into the mind itself, and so those are things I can derive a priori. I can know them independently of experience. Well, why do people see these connections? Here's one way of thinking about something. Suppose some judgment is analytic. The truth value is determined by the meanings of the terms. So it doesn't depend on the world, it just depends on language and on meaning. It can be known just by knowing meanings, independently of experience. So it's a priori. That's the kind of argument that connects being analytic to being a priori. And everybody agrees with that part. So if you think of it this way, think of the a priori as they're in that sort of salmon-colored circle, and the light gray circle being the judgments that are analytic. Everybody agrees nothing is analytic and a posteriori off on that right side. And everybody agrees some things are, well, almost everybody. There are some 20th century philosophers who disagree. But everyone of the Enlightenment period thinks that there are things that are analytic and a priori, things like bachelors are unmarried. The question is about whether there is anything a priori that is not analytic. That's where I have the blue question mark. And so here's the controversial part of this. Suppose we start with the thought that we've got a synthetic judgment. It is really about the world. The truth value depends on the world. So knowing it, the idea is, requires experience of the world. So it has to be a posteriori. Synthetic, then, implies a posteriori, And that's equivalent to saying a priori implies analytic. So that's the view of the empiricist. The empiricist will say there is nothing out there in that category of the synthetic and a priori. Everything a priori is analytic. Everything that's synthetic has to be a posteriori. But the rationalist, of course, disagrees. The rationalist says, no, there are things like that. So let's take a look at some synthetic a priori truths according to the rationalist tradition. The empiricist, notice, has to say every one of these is either true purely by virtue of meaning or is something true on the basis of experience and knowable only through experience. But the rationalist says no, I can know these things simply by reflection, reason alone, without experience, but also they go beyond merely verbal truths, they're really about the world. So here are some examples from the Islamic philosopher Avicenna. The whole is greater than its parts. Things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. In Descartes, I think, I am. He proposes those as things that are synthetic. They're really about existence, they're not just verbal. But on the other hand, I don't need experience of the world, I just need to think to recognize their truth. In fact, anyone who thinks must exist while thinking. Nothing's made from nothing, Descartes says. It's impossible for anything to be and not be at the same time. What's been done can't be undone. There was a significant debate around the middle of the 20th century about things very much like Descartes' idea, it's impossible for anything to be and not be at the same time. The question was whether something could be entirely red and entirely green, all over, at once. Well, as soon as we imagined that, we realized, no, that couldn't happen. Something couldn't be all red and all green. It's connected to a sort of riddle that was popular at the time. What's black and white and red all over? Answer is a newspaper. Red here, not R-E-D, but R-E-A-D. Kind of a bad joke. There were variants on it at the time, I remember from my childhood. What's black and white and red all over a sunburned zebra? But anyway, whether that inspired the philosophical debate or whether the philosophical debate inspired that kind of riddle, I'm not sure. However, the idea was simply, could something be black and white all over? Not partly black and partly white, but black all over and white all over. Could something be red all over and green all over? Well, let's agree that it can't be. What kind of truth is that? Is it a truth about the world or is it a truth about language? Well, it seems awkward to call it a truth about language. I mean, what the meaning of red and green entails that they are incompatible and the same thing couldn't be entirely one and entirely other. It seems odd. I mean, I don't know how to define red or green, but it would be weird that the meanings of the terms themselves determine that, and it's hard to explain how that could be. But on the other hand, if it's a truth about the world, it seems to be a fundamental truth about the world, one that I can just come to by trying to imagine the situation and realizing it's inconceivable. I can't imagine it. That doesn't really require perception or experience of the world. I don't paint things red and then try and experiment with, well, now let's paint them entirely green and see if they're both red and green all over. I don't have to. I just try to imagine it. I can't imagine it. And so the rationalist says that's a good example of a synthetic a priori truth. I can derive that just by a feat of imagination, a sort of thought experiment where I think, is that possible? And immediately I think, no. But notice there, I'm reflecting on something about my ability to imagine a scenario. I am not gaining experience of the world, but neither am I simply reflecting on the meanings of terms. I'm not thinking about language. Leibniz proposes a fundamental principle as a synthetic a priori truth, which he calls the principle of sufficient reason. There can be no fact without a sufficient reason why it should be so and not otherwise. Immanuel Kant proposes a variety of these. Every event has a cause, for example, closely related to that principle of sufficient reason. He says all truths of mathematics are like this. 7 plus 5 is 12 is the example he gives. And geometry, being between any 2 points, lies one and only one line. He says those are things that are truths about the world. They were in fact necessary truths about the world. They aren't derived from experience. I don't write down 2 points and then try drawing lines between them to figure out that between any 2 points lies one line. That's something, again, I can do purely as an act of imagination. I can do it as a thought experiment. I don't need real experience of the world. But on the other hand, I can't also understand this simply by thinking, well, what is a point? What is a line? What does the word line mean? It's not a verbal truth, but neither is it something derived from experience. It's synthetic and a priori, Kant says. And the same thing is true with truths of arithmetic, he claims, like 7 plus 5 is 12. Now you might think at first glance, oh wait, that doesn't feel as if it's really about the world. It doesn't feel as if it's something that, I mean, the a priori, I'll grant you, I don't have to do experiments here. But on the other hand, it seems like, wait, surely this is an analytic truth. And indeed, that's how Descartes and a variety of empiricists have seen it. But Kant argues this way. He says, look, you've got 7 things, and then you add 5 things together. You're taking a set of 5 and a set of 7, and now you're combining them. So here's how you might think about what's going on here. He says, I've got 5 things. Okay, so that's something like a unit. Now I've got 7 things. That's a unit. And now I say, add them together. They form this other unit of 12 things. In set theory, we would say the underlying principle is that the union of any 2 sets is a set. Well, that is why Kant is saying, this feels synthetic a priori to me. It's something that is truly a priori. I don't need to do experiments. I don't need to start laying out matchsticks or pieces of chalk and counting them and so forth. It's something I can do in my own mind, but it looks like it's not analytic either. It's not derivable merely by the meanings of addition and 5 and 7 and 12. Why? Because there's an underlying principle, something like this principle, that the union of any 2 sets is a set. And what's that? How do I know that if I've got one collection here and another collection here, I can combine them and form a larger collection? Is that part of the meaning of set or collection? Is it part of the meaning of union? I don't know how to define those things in such a way that I can explain that. And so Kant says that's a good example of something that is synthetic. It's not something that I can derive merely by the meanings of terms, but on the other hand, it's a priori. I can get it from a thought experiment, from reason alone. It doesn't require experience of the world. Well, once you grant the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments, you can get many other possibilities, and medieval philosophers exploited that. Of course, it's not just the medieval philosophers. Descartes exploits that. Leibniz exploits that. And they derive all sorts of things they take to be exciting philosophical propositions that have this character of being synthetic and a priori. So, for example, in theology, God exists, or the soul is immortal. In metaphysics in general, the world consists of substances and their attributes, something that Aristotle would have loved. The will is free, or every substance has an essence. Those Aristotelian ideas, or in the case of the freedom of the will, something that has been debated for centuries, even going back to ancient times, those are things that people have taken to be derivable independently of experience, just from reflection through reason alone, but nevertheless really be truths about the world, not merely verbal. And in ethics, you ought to seek the good. Happiness is intrinsically good. Courage is a virtue. And many, many other truths of ethics. It's hard to say how we're devising or deriving any of these things from experience. It looks like the idea that happiness is a good thing isn't something I have to learn from experience. On the other hand, it's not purely a verbal truth. And so all sorts of claims about ethics also seem to be like this. So the rationalist is going to say, actually, a lot of things fall into this category of synthetic a priori truths. Now, the empiricist has to do something about them, categorize them in this way or categorize them in that way, and sometimes that might seem plausible. The whole is greater than the parts. You could say that's part of the that just follows from the definitions of whole and part. But you ought to seek the good, for example. It doesn't feel like that's merely a verbal truth, though maybe it is. Maybe it's somehow built into the meaning of good and ought. And so there's a lot to debate with respect to every single one of those kinds of examples. Here's the key point, though. The rationalist says a huge amount of knowledge is coming purely from the mind. Of course, from the mind together with perception. But A significant portion, and the philosophically exciting portions, are coming from the mind alone, independently of experience. We're born with that knowledge. It's there as part of us, hardwired in from the very beginning.